As a child, he grew up doing mathematics and was perplexed by anomalies that didn't make sense to him, even the rules for Scrabble and Monopoly. So he changed the rules. He couldn't make mathematics work for him the way he would have liked, and in a way that would let him follow in the footsteps of his actuary father, and so he turned to economics. Richard Thaler got his PhD at the University of Rochester, where he went on the faculty, until he discovered the work of Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky and made his way to Stanford to study with them. This led him to new ways of using economics to explain the way people actually behave, rather than how theory says they should. And so Thaler once again changed the rules to make sense to him, and in the process revolutionized the entire game of economics, putting behavioral economics on the map and winning a Nobel Prize in the process. On Bloomberg Big Decisions, Richard Thaler. Richard Thaler, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
Thank you.
What drew you to economics?
You know, like many economists, I started out doing things like math and physics and realized I wasn't good enough in math to do those things. And then you sort of work your way down. And economics was about the right level of difficulty for me. My father was an actuary, and I wasn't good enough in math to do that either. So economics.
So was your father a better mathematician than you were?
Oh, yeah. And he was greatly disappointed that I didn't follow in his footsteps.
But economics, by the time you got into it, it was econometrics, a lot of it, wasn't it? Why did you want to go in even if you weren't enamored of mathematics itself?
Oh, I mean, I was pretty good in math, not good enough to be a mathematician, or not good enough to be a mathematical economist, although I didn't realize that when I was an undergrad. It's like, a baseball player that's a pretty good hitter until he sees a major league curveball. So when you get to graduate school, you learn there are people better than you in various aspects of it. And it was never clear I was a great economist. So I had to invent a different kind of economics that I was good at and nobody else was.
If we went back to the time you were in high school and we interviewed your mother, who was a teacher, as I understand it, and your father, as you mentioned, actuary, what would they have said you'd end up being?
Oh, I think my father was deeply worried about that. And wasn't sure. He was hoping that I would become an actuary. I had a brother who did go down that path. But, I think they just hoped I would get a job somewhere. I think it wasn't until I was in my mid-40s that my father thought that I might make something of myself.
From an early age, were you seeing anomalies of different things? Were you wondering about why things worked the way they did?
Yeah, and I was never happy with the way things were normally done. So when I used to play Scrabble, I was always frustrated that half the time you'd have 7 consonants, and that wasn't any fun. So I invented what I thought was a better way to play Scrabble. Which was you put the tiles into 3 bags, vowels, consonants, and high-numbered letters. And you could choose how much, if you had 4 letters, you could say, I'll take 2 consonants and 2 vowels. And then every time you played, I think it was 7 tiles, you got one of the fancy ones. And that would take the luck out of it. And I had my own rules for Monopoly, and I like improving things.
Well, I wonder whether that has an analogy with what you do with economics. You said you were not the best mathematician, a good one, but not the best mathematician or econometrician. Did you sort of reinvent the game to fit you?
I don't think I thought of it that way at the time, but I think looking back, I created a way of doing economics that I was good at, and that was lucky. Because if I hadn't stumbled onto that, I might have been a mediocre labor economist.
So you first started teaching actually at University of Rochester, I believe, when you got your PhD. And then you went to Cornell Business School. Why Cornell?
So a couple of years after starting teaching, I had discovered these two psychologists, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who were over in Israel teaching at Hebrew University. And I was quite taken with what they were doing. And I got wind of the fact that they were planning to spend a year at Stanford. And I made it my business to figure out a way to spend that year at Stanford as well. And during that year, I decided, okay, I'm going all in, if we're speaking poker language, to this new thing I had been thinking about. And I decided the University of Rochester wasn't the place to do it because it was very old school, very Chicago school, which is kind of ironic since that's my current employer. So I went on the job market, and Cornell made me an offer.
How did you discover Kahneman and Tversky? If they were over in Israel, how did you come across them at all?
Yeah, I say it's my greatest discovery. Others claim they existed before that. But, it was luck. I went to a conference and met one of their students. He said, you ought to read this stuff written by my advisors. And I went back, went into the library, found a whole new section of the library for me. I think I spent a whole afternoon reading 6 or 7 of the articles they had written at that point, and a big light bulb went off. And the big light bulb was that we all know people make mistakes. The big insight they had was that the mistakes are predictable. And all of a sudden, that made what I wanted to do feasible. To go back to baseball, if there's a sinker ball pitcher, how does he earn a living? He earns a living by fooling professional hitters because the ball suddenly dips unexpectedly. Now, even though they've seen it 100 times, they keep getting fooled by that. So that's a systematic mistake. And I've kind of spent my life studying systematic mistakes.
How far does behavioral economics go?
Well, we don't know how far it goes.
How far does behavioral economics go? Does it revise the entire foundations of economics? Does it sit to the side of traditional economics?
Well, we don't know how far it goes. How far does it go now? I think it's not really possible to do most of what economists do properly without being aware of the fact that the agents that you're studying are not as smart as you're giving them credit for. So that's true for macroeconomics. If we're going to do some stimulus program, what are people going to do with the money? Here's a question the Obama administration faced. So early on, we're in the midst of this financial crisis. There's a tax cut. Should we send everybody a $1,000 check, or should we give them $20 a week? Same thing. Well, economists would say it makes no difference. So if you ask me what to do, we want them to spend the money. I would say dribs and drabs. And the reason is we know that if people get a lump, they're more likely to save it. So given that point in time, 2009, where we wanted people out spending, just put it into their paycheck, and the people who are living paycheck to paycheck, they won't really notice it, but they'll run out of money less soon. And so they'll spend more. That is what the Obama administration did. I think it was the right thing to do economically and probably the wrong thing to do politically because nobody noticed it.
Behavioral economics potentially is a powerful tool to anticipate people's behavior and, frankly, to manipulate it to some extent. How do we make sure that it's used for good and not for ill? When you say what people should do, who's deciding the should in that sentence?
Yeah. So when people ask me to sign a copy of my book, Nudge, that I wrote with my friend Cass Sunstein, I always sign it Nudge for Good, which is a plea because I know the same tools can be used for good or evil. And there's evil nudging. I've coined a term for that. I call it sludge. Here's an example. When my book Misbehaving came out, I got an email from my editor saying, "Oh, your first review is out." And he sends me a link. And it was a London newspaper that has the tightest paywall in the business. So I click on this link, and all I get is the front page offering me a deal, a trial subscription for just £1. I could have a 30-day subscription. And I said, well, I'm willing to pay £1 to read the first review of my book, although smarter friends would say never read any of the reviews. But then I said, wait a minute, maybe, I wrote that other book. Maybe I should read the fine print. So I keep reading and I see, if you want to cancel, you have to give them 14 days notice. So this 1 month trial for £1 was actually a 2-week trial. And to cancel, you couldn't do it online. You had to call London, not on a toll-free line, and in London business hours. And so at that point I knew this would be a lifetime subscription for me at £37 a month or something like that. So I emailed my editor back and said, you subscribe.
B.F. Skinner, I believe, wrote that positive reinforcement is always more powerful than negative reinforcement. Nudge strikes me as positive reinforcement. Why is it our society almost always goes to the negative?
I don't know that I would agree with that characterization. We know there's something called loss aversion, and that losses hurt about twice as much as gains feel good. And here's an illustration of that. Some colleagues of mine at the University of Chicago, including Steve Levitt, the Freakonomics author, ran an experiment in a local school. And what they were trying to see is, what if we gave teachers more incentives? Would the students do better? And one of the experiments was they offered the teachers a $5,000 bonus if the students improved by X. In another condition, they gave teachers $5,000 at the beginning of the year, and they said, unless your students improve by X, we're going to take it back. So what happened? Well, the taking it back worked better. But the teachers hated it. And so you couldn't really use it. So yes, they would work harder, but they would look for another job. And if you think about it, is there anywhere in business where there are negative bonuses? I don't know of any. Right?
No.
And, in the financial services industry, almost everybody gets a big share of their income in terms of a bonus, but even clawbacks are rare. They shouldn't be.
You have a little side business going.
Yeah.
Fuller and Thaler. Do you have an unfair advantage? I mean,
This business is so easy. Yeah. So that was a joke.
let's apply behavioral economics to some current problems that we face. And let's start with gun violence. Is there an application that could help us with gun violence?
Well, certainly one thing you can do is an educational campaign. Many people buy guns because they think they want their family to be safer. Now, many of those people are surprised to learn that twice as many people die from gun suicides as gun homicides. And the most likely thing that happens, especially if you buy a handgun and keep it in your house, you're increasing the chance that a family member commits suicide.
What about the opioid crisis? What could be done using behavioral economics?
Here's a nice experiment. It's not the solution, but it's an illustration of what you can do. So doctors are part of the problem. You go in and you decided you were young and you would try one of those scooters and you fall off and you break your wrist. And broken bones are painful, so they give you a prescription for some kind of strong painkiller. And what would happen is they would write a prescription like for 30 of those pills. And most people, 2-3 days is enough. Why would they give 30? Because it's easier, right? Then it saves some steps. So an experiment I'm quite fond of was doctors were informed anytime a patient they had written a prescription for opioids died. Might be a year later, it might be 2 years later. Doc just wanted you to know, well, those doctors, the quantity of prescriptions they wrote dropped dramatically. So feedback, you want to teach people, give them feedback.
Macroeconomic policy. We have very low interest rates. Part of the theory is let's encourage investment, capital investment. That'll get productivity up, get growth going. Doesn't seem to be working the way one would have predicted. Are there other ways of encouraging capital investment that could help the economy overall?
Let me say two things about that. One is I'm not that surprised that low interest rates don't do the trick. And the reason is that that's not the way businesses work. If you're deciding to start suppose Mr. Bloomberg is deciding on some new venture. He's got some guesstimates as to what that business is going to do. And if he has to borrow at 2% or 3%, it's really not going to make a difference. Here's an idea that I got from the well-known economist Jon Stewart. And it is that if we want to encourage entrepreneurship, people to start new businesses, and they're not Mike Bloomberg, so they're worried about what's going to happen if this new venture fails, make sure they have health insurance. Lots of people are worried about what will happen to my family if this venture fails and I can't afford health insurance. If everybody has health insurance, I guarantee we get more business startups. It's a very counterintuitive idea. People think, these Nordic countries with their social net, it's discouraging incentive. No. It's allowing people to take risks. It's why lots of children of rich families start businesses because they're not going to be out on the street if it doesn't work.
You know, they have a cushion.
They have a cushion.
Let's
right.
apply behavioral economics to asset management. You have a little side business going.
Yeah.
Fuller and Thaler. Do you have an unfair advantage? I mean, did you just
Absolutely
raking it in because you know what the rest of us don't know?
Right. Yeah.
What are the biases? What are the irrationalities that you look
at? This business is so easy. Yeah. So that was a joke. Beating the market is hard. So we think that the only really reliable, and does not mean sure thing, but reliable way of having an edge in investing is behavioral. When Fuller and I started this firm, we had a tagline called the behavioral edge. And the edge is we think about it differently. So what we're thinking about is, what are the mistakes other investors make? And they basically fall into two categories, or at least we put them into two categories: overreaction and underreaction. Overreaction, the market moves more than it should as a result of some news event. Underreaction, they don't pay enough attention. So we divide things up into those two big bins. Then we try to find situations in which those things are likely to happen. So, for example, value investing goes back to Benjamin Graham. Mm-hmm. And buying cheap stocks, on average, gets you a couple percent return. There's an argument about whether my golf buddy Gene Fama says that's because those stocks are risky. We on the behavioral side say that's because they're mispriced. That's an argument that Gene and I can hash out on the golf course. But what we try to do at Fuller and Thaler is say, okay, among those value stocks, which are the ones that are ready to stop being beaten down? So what you need is, in value investing, is you need a company that the market has undervalued and will change their mind about. Because otherwise, they'll just stay undervalued.
Looking at your life and all the work you've done with irrationality or biases, what's the biggest irrationality you've experienced personally? The biggest bias you've identified in your life personally?
Oh, man, that's a tough one because there's so many things to choose from. You know, I think I'm not different than anybody else. Maybe overconfidence is the biggest thing that we should all worry about, because when you're really sure you're right, you're probably not. And I'm fortunate that I have a very skeptical wife whose favorite expression is, "Are you sure?"
Richard Thaler, thank you so very much. Great pleasure.
My pleasure.
It's terrific.
Joseph, we have officially this stimulus package passed. What, in terms of the way that this will work, I mean, obviously money into the hands of businesses and people is the first order of business. It's a massive deal, but there have been those who say it is still not enough. When you look at the $2 trillion, is there a chance that more will be needed here?